All right, this is No Excuses with Michael DiLeonardo. I'm your host, RJ Roger. And who we have with us today is a host of great friends of Michael. We have Angelo Santino, we have Richard Warner, and Eric Stonefelt. Now, these gentlemen are great Cosa Nostra historians, researchers, writers. They are people who take the early stages, the inception of Cosa Nostra in America very, very seriously. And that's the stuff that they specialize in. That's the stuff that they prefer talking about. So I met these gentlemen through Michael. It was very important to Michael that we bring these gentlemen onto the show. So I'd like to start with you, Michael. Can you talk a little bit about these gentlemen and why it was important for you that we brought them on?
Well, I have found these three gentlemen through another venue. And they didn't know who I was, and I didn't know who they were. And all over the course of time, I seen how in-depth, how serious, how unbiased their research was. And it really caught fire in my stomach because I'm all about this history. I love it, any part of history. But these guys touch on something that nobody in the world has ever touched on and put together. These guys are the archaeologists of the mob history. There's no matter what anybody says, what anybody book they could write or say, if you really want to know the truth, facts, unbiased, pure, unvarnished, go see these guys. They are the best. I put complete trust in them. Never caught them once slanting things because of personality or ego. They just research, and they research way back. Everybody will be impressed. You need to go to their site, Mob Archaeologist. There's another gentleman not present today, Tony. He couldn't be with us tonight. Another great voice in this, and complete trust in these guys. If you have a passion for history, this is it. These are the gentlemen, not us, them.
Yeah, absolutely. And guys, I will leave a link in the description below to the Mob Archaeologist YouTube channel. They are a new channel. They just began. So if you click in the description, click the link, you can subscribe to their channel. Please subscribe to the channel. That's the best support that you can give to content creators. Please also subscribe to our channel, No Excuses. So let's jump right into it, gentlemen. So I want to start this conversation off with talking about Lucky Luciano. He's one of the guys who I personally enjoy researching the most. And one of the books that I just was always enjoyed reading is very entertaining. How accurate it is, that's up for debate. But The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano. I spoke with you, Angelo, by phone. You had discussed with me that a lot of the information that's out there on Lucky is based off of that book, but that book is in question. So I want to start with you, Rick, because I know what you did some research and you found there to be, let's call it historical inaccuracies to many of the major claims in that book.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate the question. Yeah, so the book was first found to have problems by Nicholas Gage of the New York Times. He's a well-known crime writer, and he interviewed a lot of people that were connected to Lucky Luciano, including his former attorney, and they were able to dispute a lot of the material in the book. There was another writer named Tony Scaduto who used to write for the New York Post. He found a lot of problems as well. And then finally, the FBI did a thorough analysis of it, and they called Martin Gosh, the author of the book, a liar, and they declared the book to be a fraud. And there's a lot of misinformation in the book, a lot of facts that he would have known. You know, I realized that in the book, it's supposed to be Lucky Luciano recalling events going back 30 or so years, but this includes errors of recent information, around the time of his death that he got wrong. In one example in the book, Lucky Luciano talks about Meyer Lansky being heavily invested in a casino in the Bahamas. Turns out the casino didn't exist until 1964, and Lucky Luciano died in 1962. So unless he had prophetic abilities, I seriously doubt he would have known that. There's a lot of other examples that just show that, you can't trust it. Could there be a kernel of truth in there? Sure, there could be. He did meet with them a couple times, but he took notes. But when Martin Gosh, who was I believe he was a screenwriter, he was meeting with Lucky Luciano to write a fictional story about him. And it's believed they only met a few times at most. So you wouldn't have been able to really get a full book out of him. And even then, we can find out where the factual errors came from in a lot of cases, where he borrowed them from other books. Sometimes there were mistakes in other books that were copied and found in his book. So there's a lot of issues with that book. It's not recommended.
Okay. Now, from what you guys have looked at in your research, and Angelo, I'll ask this question to you. What would you say, take the book away, if researchers can't use that book to go find out information about Lucky Luciano, or what's the truth about Lucky Luciano, what would you say Lucky Luciano's role in the establishment or helping to form Cosa Nostra in America, or what would you say was his contribution, his big contribution to Cosa Nostra?
I think Luciano has to be divided into two different categories. You have Luciano the man and you have Luciano the legend. Luciano the legend is what is the more popular story, and that goes back to the Gosh book, where Luciano's the first Italian to ever talk to a Jew, and then they hook up with a Calabrese and another Jew, and then it's 4 men against the world, and they're going to go out and change everything. All of that comes from Martin Gosh. There's a lot of things in that book, such as Luciano surviving getting his face slashed by Maranzano, and he's in the hospital, and Lansky's like, "Hey, that's you, Lucky." There's an article on the day that he was attacked, and it wasn't by Maranzano. I believe it was by the police. Rick, correct me if I'm wrong, but he already had that name Lucky going back before that, because on the day that he survived that attempt, there was a newspaper headline that said "Lucky, not so lucky." So there's that. And everything else in the Gosh book, ranging from Luciano forming the new name or creating, consigliere for Meyer Lansky, there's really nothing to substantiate that. When it comes
something
to
I want to say.
Oh, no,
I was going to say
ahead.
about the nickname. It's evident that his nickname comes from his last name. His original surname was Lucania,
Right.
and Valachi referred to him as Charlie Lucky, which makes sense. Charlie Lucania, Luciano. So the Lucky Luciano nickname, to me, it's evident that comes from his surname, which sounds like Lucky. We know a million of these guys' nicknames come from their surname, just shortening it. So I just wanted to add that.
Very good.
Interesting. Angelo, continue.
Where did I leave off?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, so what you were talking about is this, part of what you were talking about, which I hope you can expand on, is this relationship with these Jewish partners that he had, Lansky and Siegel and things like that. Were those relationships as strong and as real as this book makes it seem, that these were people who were tied at his hip at all times?
We have very little confirmation on the exact relationship between Luciano and Bugsy Siegel. We know that him and Costello knew each other. We knew that he held Lansky in some high regard, because that is referenced by Joe Bonanno and other sources, which indicate, a close relationship. But a lot of it's been, glossed over, and history has defaulted into fable. When it comes to people in that world, including guys in the 1930s, 1920s, 10s, 1890s, they were open to having other people around them who were not from Sicily or from Italy. They were very pragmatic people. When it came to taking on people to work in certain endeavors, you weren't looking at who was Italian, you were looking at who was getting the job done. Going back to counterfeiting or even bootlegging, when it comes to creating alcohol, both of those jobs, they require a special knowledge of how to do certain things. Manufacturing alcohol and manufacturing counterfeit notes requires a little bit amount of chemistry to that. And not, when it came to looking for the proper chemist, you were looking for who could get the job done.
It goes back to counterfeit. It goes back to like 1909, right? With the Italian squad, they were chasing counterfeit money around.
Yeah,
right.
1900s.
Yeah, so right, it goes all the way back then. So this predates a lot of the Luciano myths also, with that structure that was already in place. And that's, if you could talk about the structure prior to Luciano, setting up this 5 families, quote unquote, right? Was there a structure? What kind of structure? Was it international at that time? Had to come to the States? All those, I know I'm throwing a lot of questions at you, but the thing about Luciano being the start and the end of Cosa Nostra is, to me, is a huge misnomer, because it was a place with massive structure before that. You want to take a shot at that?
Each and every family in the U.S. was imported from Sicily by members who were importing the tradition into the New World. And with it already came a built-in system that was implemented all the way back in the 1830s, at least, in terms of the structure, in terms of operandi, conflict resolution, and it built and evolved as time went on. The structure didn't so much change as much as the world around it. When transportation was hard, these guys relied on writing letters to each other. After 1905, when transportation, and trains were a lot more accessible, that's when you started having general assemblies. The hierarchy that we all know and understand it to be, it's in all the movies, that goes back to Sicily. There's evidence of it in 1860. There's evidence of it in 1890, in America, 1900, 1920, and so forth, including ruling bodies. All these groups were connected via a General Assembly and a Grand Consiglio about this as early as 1908 and all the way up to 1930. The commission was just a upgraded form of what was the Grand Consiglio.
And the cutoff of the Grand Consiglio was the commission, and was that with Luciano started, or it was started prior to him?
The Grand
Right.
Consiglio goes back to at least 1908.
Okay, so could you break down Grand Council for us? What exactly what it was, for the people who don't really know the true definition of it? Well, who are these people?
In the United States, you had what was called the General Assembly, and that was represented, or members of every family, including their underlings, could be present at this General Assembly. According to Gentile, the attendance was 100, 200, 300, I think even said 500 people in some cases. He might have been over-exaggerating the numbers. I don't think he counted everybody, but it goes to show that there was just quite a lot of people in the room. That was the General Assembly. When it came to the Grand Consiglio, above that, we don't really know too much about it. We can guess that it was composed of probably the top representatives from around the country. I'm going to guess that it was probably the New York, as well as Chicago, and maybe some other ones. But both Richard and Eric are going to have something to say about that.
You figure New Orleans at the time? New Orleans, you hear me? And because I like to talk just a little bit about New Orleans and its impact on the States with the importation of the Sicilian migration and what they came here for. There were several things. It wasn't just important the mob.
Eric, do you want to take this one?
Absolutely.
Eric?
Yeah, with just to go back to what you were saying a second about the Grand Consiglio, we actually have a letter, and Angelo provided a translation of it, where Giuseppe Morello, who was the capo dei capi, he wrote a letter to the Chicago boss explaining the distinction between the Grand Consiglio and the National Assembly. And he's telling him there's a difference, there's different protocol required. So these weren't just arbitrary bodies. They weren't just winging it. That very well could have been brought over from Sicily as well. There was an early Sicilian source who was made around World War I, Dr. Melchior Allegra. He was a physician, not entirely uncommon back then. And he in one reference, he refers to a General Assembly in Sicily. So that existed in Sicily. The Grand Council might have as well. But as far as, I don't know about, Rick knows a lot more about New Orleans specifically, but as far as these bodies go, these were very regimented. They were very disciplined. The mafia wasn't just a loose confederation of gangs focused purely on crime. They committed crime, but the actual organization itself was far more expansive, far more dynamic. It was based on networks and relationships that already existed in Sicily that they transplanted here. I imagine New Orleans played a prominent role in some of these early national governing bodies and everything. And then as more people moved to New York, as New York became, and something to remember too, is in 1898, New York became the primary immigration port for many people, but specifically Italians and Sicilians. So a lot of people were coming to New York. The little Italy there, bloomed. So we can assume New Orleans played a much bigger role earlier on in this process. Much later, this is kind of going out there, but much later, they were said to be the only family who didn't have to report to the commission because they were the first family to have formed in the U.S. So they may have played a role in those early governing bodies, but by the 1960s, New Orleans was given this special honor of not actually even belonging to the commission, not having to be represented by them, which is interesting.
Yeah, and you had Carlos Marcello at that time, who was stepped into power. New Orleans, they brought in all the citrus, which has supplanted the cotton at that time. These are interesting things that, you take a city like New Orleans where people didn't, novices don't realize the strength that it had and the outreach, and go on to mob archaeologists, and they will tell you how it was spanned from several families that were formed in California and all over the rest of the country. And the meetings they had, we talked about trains, stagecoaches at a time, and sending letters all from on different continents. So it's really a fascinating thing, and these gentlemen are going to break it down. And the thing is, we want to get rid of the stuff that's not true, that we know it's not true, to put history in its proper place. And you guys are the guys to do it. Yeah,
that's what I find. This is high, even among readers and researchers and people who really are appreciative of Cosa Nostra history. I've heard guys that have big followings take the position that everything started in 1931, and Lucky, when he put this commission in place, that's when the real Cosa Nostra, that's when Cosa Nostra began. That's when it became organized. That's when they became this interconnected network. And I'm telling you, this isn't from some Joe Blow. I'm talking about guys that put the crown on themselves as, I'm one of the best. And they have this theory that this whole thing started in 1931. So do you guys have any evidence that you guys can talk about, or anything you guys can share to explain maybe the organizational structure and how this thing was interconnected even back during Giuseppe Morello, maybe D'Aguila, people who were far before Lucky Luciano?
Can I say something just real quick about a comment you just made about, people thinking Luciano created the commission in 1931, or even if you don't want to attribute it to Luciano, just the idea that the commission was a brand new idea after Maranzano's death. That's not true. Nicola Gentile, who people aren't as familiar with as they should or could be, but he was made in the early 20th century. And so in his memoir, he describes all these processes, how formal this thing was. And during the Castellamarese War, as it was winding down, they deposed Joe Masseria, who was the capo dei capi. And they actually proposed a formation of a commission before Maranzano was even the capo dei capi. This was an idea. They were already thinking about getting rid of that position before Luciano was even a boss. He was actually a capodicina in the Masseria family at the time. And they proposed forming this commission, which was going to be headed by a guy that nobody has really heard of, but he was a big name, Vincenzo Troia. He was connected to Illinois, and he was later killed in New Jersey. But they were going to form what they were calling a commission with him as sort of a chairman. Maranzano pushed back on that, and Maranzano became the capo. Then when Maranzano was killed, they formed the commission as we know it today, which Luciano was influential with. But people have a tendency to want to assign this Messiah-like role to him as if it all goes back to one guy. So I just wanted to clarify that the commission itself, like even though, as Angelo said, it was an evolution likely of the Grand Consiglio, they were actually talking about forming the commission prior to Luciano being boss, prior to Maranzano being the capo dei capi.
Yeah, so if you guys can, is there anything you guys can talk about as far as to show how families in different states and different sides of the country, how they work together and how they were working in a connected way long before there was a powerful Lucky Luciano? Is there any evidence that you guys have towards meetings that took place, sit downs that took place, orders that were given out, anything like that?
Well, the examples that were brought up earlier, the letters found in the Barrel Mystery book, there's correspondence between the boss of Chicago as well as another one to the head of New Orleans. And so this gives us some insight into the history of New Orleans that you were asking about earlier. That the General Assembly and the Grand Consiglio, they operated using parliamentary rules. And a lot of these rules, there are continuities from Sicily. You know, they adapted the rules used in government and, land ownership, that sort of thing, as well as the church and early radical groups, such as the Carbonari and Freemasonry, that there were elements of each of these groups adapted in the organization and structure of the mafia, and that was brought over to the United States. So the first family, as already mentioned, is New Orleans, and that may go back as far as the 1850s. And we don't know for certain who the bosses were going back that far, but in one of Giuseppe Morello's letters, he's corresponding with the Vincenzo Morecci, and before that, through another letter that we found earlier and reprinted in the New York Times and New York Herald, it talks about the House of Lupo, and that's reminiscent of European royal houses. So that indicates to us that Lupo is the boss of his own family, and through connections that we previously discussed on our program, that he was the predecessor to Nicola.
You know what I find interesting, and maybe Eric, you could define this a little bit, is how they say, instead of like we say Bogado or family today when there's a reference to newspapers or even with Cosa Nostra members, they would say the house of. I found that so interesting. Mm-hmm. Because the house there's a family that lives in the house, right? So the house the father has all the children. So when they're talking about a boss, this is my interpretation of it. When they're talking about a boss of a family in a city or state, they're talking about the house of. That means everybody in his family, his children, relatives. But we're talking about Cosa Nostra members, and I found that interesting because I really never heard that, and it's something a new term And you guys came up with that new term for your discovery. And when you started talking about it, I think it was about a month or so ago, where I was on the phone, I found it really fascinating that it was not one instance, many. And they talked about huge names at that time. So it held a lot of weight when they said the house of. And I think it's more of a romantic term.
Well, what plays into that is in Joe Bonanno's book, which, you know, should be looked at critically as well. I mean, he obviously had his own agenda, but there's a lot of good information in that too. And he insists that the term they used in his family for the boss was father. You know, we know the most common terms back then were capo. You know, today we think of that as capo de Cina, but back then capo was the typical term for boss of a family, as well as rappresentante, which is more political representative. Bonanno, though, he insists that in his family he was called the father with a capital F. Well, there's actually wiretaps from the 1960s during the Bonanno War where Sam DeCavalcanti, the boss in New Jersey, he's mediating the Bonanno family dispute, and he's caught on wiretap saying, you know, it's the weirdest thing. All the members of his family keep calling him the father. So Bonanno, he appears to be telling the truth that they called him the father in that family, but that wasn't typical. You know, apparently, Sam DeCavalcanti was Sicilian. His father was a captain. You know, they were an important family from Sicily. And Sam found it weird, though. But it shows you Bonanno might have had that mentality of like, I'm the father of a family. I'm the father of a house, a royal house, as well as like, this is my domain.
Right. Exactly.
And it shows how differently just over time things have changed just by that little interpretation there. There's a good interview where one of the things I really took out of that interview with Mike Wallace was when Wallace kept saying, well, you were the boss. This said that you were the boss. And he got kind of upset. And he goes, oh, boss, no, I'm just the father.
I was the most respected man in New York and all over the country.
Yeah, the letters that I see from you gentlemen, even one with my grandfather, talking to Vito Cascio Ferro, the way these guys talk in these other letters is affectionately.
Yes.
I hope this finds you in good health and all this beautiful language. And these are subtle messages in there, but they respected the guy they were talking to and made it known in a letter. There was no just cold, hard writing and X, Y, and Z in there. No, there was a super respect for family, that they're the family. That's how this thing really started, because most of the people in these families go trace back to Sicily, war blood family.
Exactly.
Members war blood family. And they incorporate other guys that were compadres and close paisans from each town. So they were a family. That's the way they really considered themselves. And that is old school. And you just have all the information for people to digest like I did. Like I know I'm sounding redundant, but I'm still astonished by those letters that you found. It's amazing.
Joe Bonanno in his book used the term men of respect. Maybe you guys can elaborate on that. But I remember reading that he said men of tradition, men of honor, men of respect. I heard those terms before, in addition to the honored society, men of tradition. So you're right, Michael. It was this supreme honor that they had that they looked at each other with.
Man of honor. And I believe, with sense of integrity, I was born a man of honor.
Yeah, and just another point I'd like to see if we could get to is, when do you think the real attachment, the obligation almost with Sicily ended? Was it the time when Luciano created 5 families? In that sense of having a commission now with 5 groups, because prior to that, there was a lot of interaction with Sicily, even with people, bosses here sending people in Italy to solve their problems in Sicily, the wars they were having. So when do you think that really started to separate, that the United States became more independent and Sicily became more independent of each other? Because in the States, in my tenure, and as far as I remember, anybody who came from Sicily and landed here, if they didn't wind up with a specific group, they were really like a non-entity. If they had to do something, they had to get permission. So they were still members of the Sicilian Mafia or the Drangheta or the Camorra or whatever groups were out there. When they came here, they were really, I'm not going to say nothing. They were still very much respected, but they had no power, no say. So when do you think, if anybody, because I really don't know, I'm trying to put it around after 1932-ish, that started to separate and become more autonomous in the United States than Sicily.
I'll go ahead. It never ended completely. Certain factions, for sure. I mean, as you know, Michael, there were Sicilian factions in your family. There were certain people. There were people who still had blood relatives who were made members in Sicily or even bosses. You know, it's evident that these early national U.S. bodies, the Grand Council, the National Assembly, the Capo, that was designed so that the U.S. could govern itself distinct from Sicily. We know they still were involved in each other's politics. But as far as after 1931, we know Luciano, according to Joe Valachi, Luciano sent word when he was in Italy to stop recognizing Sicilian mafia members because he didn't trust them. However, that had little effect on all of the guys who had deep connections to Sicily. We know a lot of guys still went back and forth. Transfers between Sicily and the U.S. still happened. They weren't as common, but they still existed. I mean, you can look at a guy like Angelo Bruno, the Philadelphia boss, where his first cousin was the boss of Vallelunga in Caltanissetta. He had other relatives who were involved with the Sicilian mafia. They came here and visited him. So you have relationships like that. It wasn't like members of the Sicilian mafia came here and they were immediately given stature, but the network still existed, the relationships, the hometowns, kinship, all of that still definitely played a role. And as we're seeing, it still does, amazingly.
Yeah.
Well, now, if I could follow up on that. So the relationships we know probably may have always existed where there was communication or relationships of some sort. But was there ever a time that Sicily was controlling what was happening over here? I mean, what was happening over here? I have my answer, but I'm curious of what you guys would say to that.
No, we've never seen that where Sicily had control of what's happening in the United States. There's always been autonomy, but there's always been connections as well. So it's been an interactive relationship. But they don't have any, you never had any controlling authority, even at the very beginning. You know, once you're in the new country, you know, you maintain the connections with the old country. You know, maybe originally with the very first families, you know, they had to get recognition from Sicily. You know, they needed that formal recognition at that time. But after a certain point, it was up to the American Capo di Capi and then the commission to give recognition to any new families that were created.
Now, can I further ask, is there any relationships that we know of between Cascio, Ferro, and Morello? And because I know that there were some, you know, Cascio Ferro, I believe, was in and out. He was here, he was in the States a couple times on visits and things, and he went back. Did he maintain some kind of relationship with Morello, and did he have any influence over Morello to be able to influence what was going on in the States?
Do you mean Morello or Masseria or Maranzano?
Giuseppe Morello.
Oh,
Did
Giuseppe
Cascio
Morello.
Ferro,
Okay.
did they have any type of relationship that there's evidence to show?
They were together every day.
Okay.
They were documented by the SS report. The SS agents were following them around, and Morello and Cascio Ferro were together all the time. Before that, he was around Salvatore Clemente before he got arrested. The early time of Cascio Ferro in America doesn't give me the sense that he was like a visiting dignitary or that he was teaching people how to do extortion. Those are things that you hear about him. He was in that world. He was connected to people in the 1900s, you know, in lower Manhattan. They'd go to Brooklyn sometimes, but they were together every day.
Wasn't he in New Orleans also?
Yeah.
Or am I mistaken?
Yeah, they went to New Orleans together, and Morello wore like a red bandana, and it was tied Sicilian style, you know, with the hanging parts, and that meant something. We don't know what it means.
So the reason I asked that question, now I knew the answer, but I wanted to get you guys on record. So, so I guess what I would say then next is, so Cascio Ferro was highly influential in Sicily, from my understanding, and then you have Morello, who was highly influential over here in the States. Now, so that's why I asked the question, and Rick, you kind of answered it. Could did Cascio Ferro have influence over Morello to implement what he wanted done in the over here at that time, or could Morello have said, no, this is what I'm going to do, and that's that? Like, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Was there any kind of control or influence coming from Sicily that could have been coming from Cascio Ferro?
I think it's very possible they were influenced because they were friends. You know, they were friends, they were respected colleagues.
Yeah.
And he might have saw Cascio Ferro as a respected elder. You know, he had experience in Sicily, so he would have sought him out for advice, but he also had made his own decisions. He was the top authority figure here in the States, but they were colleagues. You know.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Now, my grandfather was from Busacchino. He was Buscanese. So was Cascio Ferro, right? And he had that relationship, Cascio Ferro, with the guys in Harlem, which was Morello, right? That was his home base, really. And then you had D'Agola, was the upstart on Morello early on, who winds up pushing up and going to war against these guys. Right? He even gives Morello a death sentence. So Cascio Ferro is in the middle. I think this is maybe where RJ was going. I just thought about this. He's in the middle of two people he may know very well, because a lot of my grandfather's crew from that town winds up in D'Agola's side. And he's with, as Angelo stated, he's with Morello daily when he gets there. And they're traveling the country. So what do you think, again, and the hypothetical is, what do you think? And there's a timeline here because Morello goes to jail, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's the timeline? Do you think there's this break of maybe Cascio Ferro not being the oil in the water to make everything smooth, and then these two guys really have a falling out, D'Agola and Morello, and the rest of them, and it leads to that war. So is Cascio Ferro the guy that keeps peace? And then when no, go ahead.
No, he was back in Sicily by, I want to say 1913, 1914, maybe even earlier. He was already out of the picture. 1904. I'm a decade off. Yeah, he was out of the picture for most of the affairs that were going on, especially in the 1920s when Morello and D'Aquila did have that dispute. I don't know where Cascio Ferro was. He might have already been in prison.
Well, he died in prison, World War II, I think. But it wasn't in the teens that D'Agola and Morello had these hard feelings? It didn't start in the teens? Like 1912, around there?
In the teens, Morello was in prison.
Yeah. So this D'Agola pushed up on him, right?
He was in Atlanta. Lupo was also. So there were.
Yeah. Lupo and Morello were both in jail. I'm sorry, Rick. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I apologize. Continue.
Right. Yeah, there were different people running the families that time. There was, Fortunato Lamonte had become boss, and he was apparently killed by D'Aquila, and then eventually a successor to Morello and Lamonte, by name of Salvatore Locoino. He's apparently more respectful of D'Aquila. He could be maybe a puppet of D'Aquila's, but operating Morello's old family, because D'Aquila had killed off or chased out a number of members of Morello's Borgata.
And what year, Rick? Is this the 20s or in the teens?
It was in the teens and extended to the early 20s.
Right. Okay.
Just to go back to something real quick, RJ, I just want to add something in. You were asking about Vito Cascio Ferro's reputation and stuff. Rick can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe there's evidence that he had. We don't know that he was a boss before he came to the U.S. initially at the turn of the century, but there was a banquet held in his honor, attended by Morello, a guy named Carlo Costantino, who would also be allegedly involved with the Petrosino murder a few years later. Costantino was likely with what's now the Bonanno family, but they did hold a banquet. There were a bunch of guys, some of the most important guys in New York. There was a letter that was obtained where the attendees of this banquet were listed. So Cascio Ferro was important enough to have a banquet held in his honor with the Capo dei Capi and some other top guys. And it should be noted, too, that Bisacchino, where Michael's family comes from and where Cascio Ferro's from, is very close to Corleone. That's the same part of Palermo province. So there were likely some hometown regional connections that already existed between them as well.
Yeah, I understood that with the Corleonese, but then there's also the people from Rivera and Agrigento. They had, because they sat on the border, so that town, Corleone and Busacchino, they had these relationships, and I think that's the guys that wind up mostly in D'Aguilar's outfit. I use the word outfit for another word out there, and his family. So you the last time Cascio Ferro comes to the States is 1904?
That's when he left from New Orleans. After the Ferro murder in 1903, he left New York for New Orleans, and he stayed in hiding because he was wanted by the police for questioning. And he, by 1904, he was back in Sicily. And
I just learned something.
He became a boss a little bit after that.
Okay.
Now, isn't there some evidence about I don't know what year it is, but wasn't there a meeting between Cascio Ferro and Giuseppe Morello inside of a restaurant and I think the owner had put some information out that he just overheard some talking, and he continued to hear them refer to each other as Godfather or something. I think I read some information somewhere about that. So what year around or so would that have been? Or is that even accurate? But I do recall reading information about this meeting, and this owner was just astounded by the way they were addressing each other and the deference they were giving to each other.
1903.
That was 03. Wow, that was far back. That was back further than what I had thought. Wow, that's interesting. Okay. So we shift gears a little bit. Angelo, this question's for you. So when me and you were speaking privately by phone, you mentioned something I found very interesting, how you and what I find about the way you look at this so interesting is the way you broke it down to me is that these were a series of political positions. Is that how you referred to it over the phone? Political?
Yes.
Okay. Can you explain a little bit? Because you see this organization far more in depth, and you see it more than just this crime group that goes around and kills, as do I, as do most real authentic researchers. So can you kind of explain a little bit about what you about these appointments in these different seats and how this thing actually works, where it's not just this, well, I'm taking the position of boss. Like, can you kind of break that down for us a little bit?
Well, it's a secret society, and it's not centered around managing crime. They do not elevate people to oversee certain rackets. That might happen in an operational sense where somebody's given something, but it's not like there's a finance captain, a hitman captain, a stolen cars captain who oversees all those rackets in an area. These positions are not filled by people who have a criminal acumen as much as it is by people who are leaders of men who are able to mediate and arbitrate within the society and stand up and represent the members under them. That's what the organization is it's a system of representation. Everybody is going to have a representative up into the top. Associates are going to have representation by soldiers, soldiers by captains, all the way up to, you know, bosses with the General Assembly or the commission later on. It's more of a system of representation. What people do in their daily lives, you know, we're talking operational, be it so-and-so is a bookmaker, so-and-so does this, this, or that. You know, these are things that they do in their life that is external to the organization itself. There's no criminal quota. People don't join the mafia, they are selected. And once they're members, they're not told to go out and fulfill a criminal quota. It's not like 1994's Donnie Brasco with Sonny Black yelling at everybody how he's got to answer. There might have been some that happened later on, but majority of the time, it's just a system of representation.
If I can also, I want to ask, and we can all try and discuss this, but the three of you guys can discuss this. Salvatore Maranzano. What was his contribution? What did he do? Like what? I mean, he gets talked about probably second there to Lucky. But what was? Can you talk a little bit about Salvatore Maranzano, his contribution, how he got here, the power that he rose to, and how he got there?
Yeah, that's the thing. See if you could establish a timeline and just jump into that seat.
First, we should say that from Dr. Melchior Allegra, who I mentioned was a made member in Sicily who cooperated. He was made around World War I. He said that Salvatore Maranzano was a capo provincia in Sicily. You know, he was from Castellammare del Golfo. And even back then, they had provincial representatives. So this wasn't the boss of a family. They would elect somebody to be the provincial representative. Maranzano, we don't know if he was the boss of Castellammare, but he was the provincial capo. And at that time, they didn't have the commission in Sicily as we understand it, with the capo mandamenti, you know, all that. They did have provincial heads, which Maranzano was. He lived in Palermo. He was very intimately involved in all of the, you know, all the entire machine that was going on in the Palermo mafia. But he was from Trapani, you know, he was from Castellammare, which produced a lot of Bonanno members. So I think that's just a crucial detail in all of this, that he held not just the position of boss, but he was actually a provincial boss in Sicily before he even came to the U.S.
And he was a study of Caesar in the Roman Empire, right? Am I correct?
Very educated.
Very.
He studied for the priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Spoke a bunch of languages, they said.
So he wanted to be a priest, and he couldn't be a priest, so he sent everybody when they were dead to the priest.
There you go.
Now, hey, Rick, in the last testament of Lucky Luciano, in his book, he says that Salvatore Maranzano was a cross nut, a religious nut, and he had crosses hanging all over the place and inside that ceremony where he declared himself Capo di tutti Capi. Is that true, at least?
Yeah, Martin Gosh had a vivid imagination.
I knew you were going to say that.
So when does Maranzano take the leap into the position in the States? When did he get to the States? We talked about he was in Sicily, right? When did he come to the States, and who was his group he went into, and how did he get to that leap, if I may ask?
Well, let me give a little bit of background. Eric had mentioned that he was a capo provincia, and he lived in Palermo at the time. Now, in the early 1920s, and you had talked about the conflict earlier with Aquila, Lupo, Morello, and their allies and supporters traveled to Sicily around 1921, 22 in order to remove the death penalty from Lupo and Morello and their associates. And I think it's very likely that one of the people they would have met was Maranzano, because he had a position of power back there. So when Maranzano came to the United States, he already had that respect, that they knew what position he held, and they knew that he held a position of authority. However, once in the United States, there was no openings for a boss. So he became a soldier in the family of Colasquiro, which is what is now the Bonanno family. And he was still considered a leader, even though he was only a soldier. People would look up to him. And once Colasquiro left New York City in 1930, he was seen as a leader. Whether he was voted in officially, he was seen as a de facto leader of the Skiro group, at least a faction of it, but it's, I would say, a significant faction that probably grew over time. And they worked together with the Lucchese's. At the end of the Castellammarese War, he very likely becomes the official capo of what is now the Bonanno family, and then the Capo di Capi. His position as Capo di Capi, boss of bosses.
What year, Rick?
That would be in 1931, and it only lasted for a few months. Giuseppe Masseria was killed in, I believe, April 15th, 1931, and Maranzano was killed September 10th, 1931. So he wouldn't have been able to hold a position for all that long.
Wow.
And a lesser known detail about him too is that he was very entrepreneurial. He came to the United States. He was investing in businesses. He was buying properties. I mean, this guy was already an aristocrat. He was already part of the upper class. I mean, going back, something we can say for sure is Joe Valachi went to his house and talked about how he had his own little personal library. And he said he came across like a banker, not a gangster. One thing that's interesting is he actually had a farm in Hamilton, Ontario, which is Buffalo family territory. And as we know, the Castellammarese were very influential in Buffalo. Stefano Magaddino was the boss. And there's a wiretap where Stefano Magaddino in the 60s is talking about Maranzano. And he says, you want to belong with the Borgata in New York when things are going well there. And then you want to belong with my Borgata when things aren't going well there. Hard to say for sure, but there's an indication that Maranzano may have actually been a member of the Buffalo family for a time, bounced back and forth under Magaddino. So that's something you don't see printed anywhere, but there's reason to suspect that he may have been both a Buffalo soldier as well as a Bonanno soldier before he became boss.
So I want to ask you, gentlemen, one final question, because it's a popular thing that goes around. Al Capone. I've heard people say,
Where's Tony? We need Tony here.
we need Tony bad right now. Now, this drives me nuts, but let me get three great researchers, the archaeologist perspective. People say Al Capone was never a made guy. He was he wasn't a mafia member. He wasn't a Cosa Nostra member. He was just the gang leader. And again, we get some guys that take positions that I don't even know if they even tried to find the information. But I want to know what you guys think. Al Capone, what was his role in Cosa Nostra? Was he a member? Was he in the mafia?
Short answer, yes.
Yep.
It would really be good to have Tony and Rick, or Tony on here and Rick to discuss that, because they can go into it a lot better than I can. But
Do it on your
essentially,
Do it on your show.
Capone, he had to go through the proper protocol. He had to go through it like everything else. He didn't take it over from the outside. He took it over from the inside. I think of Philadelphia in 1993. If all that stuff happened back in 1903, you would have been hearing about the Merlino mobs and the Stanfa mob and how Merlino took over the whole city, which is kind of what you hear about today. But when you dig deeper into it, Merlino had to get made into Philadelphia. He had to do things from the inside. There was a protocol to it. Mm-hmm. Even though, go ahead.
Just to lay out the actual evidence, we have Nicola Gentile as well as a Milwaukee informant, Augie Maniaci, who was close to the Chicago family. Both of them say that Al Capone was inducted into what's now the Genovese family. He was with Joe Masseria. He was living in Chicago, but he was ex-New York. He was inducted into the Genovese family while living in Chicago, promoted to Capo di Cina. He was apparently given permission to induct some of his own men. I know Rick will have some thoughts on this. He eventually transferred, or some arrangement was made for him to become the rappresentante of the Chicago family in 1931. But he was initiated into Cosa Nostra, 100%.
Yeah, we also have additional information from the Bonannos that Capone was in the commission in 1931.
Yes.
You have to be a member to be on the commission.
Guys,
And also,
thank you.
one other thing. There's that Statler hotel meeting, December 5th, 1928. I think we could both put it up on both our sites with the list of names of the attendees, which it's out there. And one of the reports was there's Chicago guys there already. And the report was Capone was on his way. He just didn't make it and get his picture taken with the rest of the guys. So he would never be able to be at that meeting with people from all over the country that attended it. And Chicago had a huge representation. I think there was 3 or 4 members there already at that meeting, or 3 members already at that meeting. So, that would be an interesting little document for other people to see with that picture, along with the names of we flashed the picture, but I don't think we've ever put the names up of these attendees. I think it'll be bode well on your site, and we're going to do the same thing. And if I may, for closing out, I want History Channel, A&E, Netflix. Go get these guys. They belong on the History Channel. They belong there telling the story. Go get their information.
Yes. And if I can follow on top of Michael, before I met you, gentlemen, Michael and I spoke many times about you. He always told me how the in-depth research you guys do. I wish there was more people to do what you do. And if I can give you guys a little bit of encouragement after being on YouTube for over a year, what you guys do is uniquely your own. You guys take a special interest in getting to the facts, not the glamorous stuff, not the viewers, like how do we get more views by talking about something. A lot of the reason why the public is largely misinformed is because the lack of truth is more salacious and more romantic than the actual truth. It gets more views.
That's cool.
Yes, it's more Hollywood. A lot of the stuff that we're being taught by a lot of people who call themselves historians, they're more into generating traffic than they are in telling the history. So I appreciate what you guys do. You guys are fantastic. You guys have corrected me on things. You guys have taught me. I always consider myself to be like this great freaking historian. And I get on the phone with you guys. I go, damn, they were right. So I thank you guys. I appreciate what you guys do. You guys are a great contribution to this genre. Most importantly, what I would say is I always looked at Cosa Nostra. This is why I research it. It's much more than a crime syndicate, a criminal organization. It's actually a lot that can be learned from studying this society. And you guys help to further that, that we can look at it from more than where are the bodies buried. So I'm grateful for you guys coming on YouTube because we need you guys on YouTube bad. Okay. So what you guys do on your channel is fantastic. So I hope everyone that watches this show, if you're really a believer and have a real interest in the history of Cosa Nostra, the mob archaeologists, again, there's a link below. These are, I would say, the senior most well-researched guys in the country. The world. Let's just go there. These guys, their information is so fact-checked and so they won't even talk. I've been on phone calls with these gentlemen. If I ask them a question and they can't prove it with evidence, the phone call is silent. You hear nothing. They won't just take a position that they can't prove. That's what this genre needs. People who look for the information, that dig for the bones. So you guys are a great contribution to putting a historical record in place. There's some great writings that they have been a part of. I will also leave those links below Informer. Rick was involved in that. Angelo was involved in that. There's some great charts that they have put together. We'll leave all these links in the description.
Eric's article.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Eric.
Must reads.
Guys, if you want to do one thing for Michael and I's channel, please give your viewership and your support and your subscription to the Mob Archaeologists. They are good. They're good guys, and they take this stuff very, very serious. And gentlemen, it's a great honor to appear on here with you. I'm a longtime researcher. Being on this screen with, my brother and my friend Michael, who I love. He's a great human being, but just who he represents in this world that we all research, and then being on here with the greatest researchers and historians of our time, the three of you, is a great honor for me. It's a bottle cap moment for me to be on this screen with you guys. So I really greatly appreciate you, gentlemen.
Thank you, RJ. Can I just say something real quick too? Just in closing, first of all, Michael, he actually named our show. He formally recognized us, so to speak. No, but he named us Mob Archaeologists. We thought that was a great name. It describes what we do, and how can we turn that down? Michael blessing our show like that. But we see this too. It's in the spirit of collaboration. You guys are coming from a very similar place. We're already friends. You have our total support. We're grateful to be on here. There's so much to gain from, us four coming together to do a show. We've collaborated so much, not even necessarily, obviously on certain projects, but we've also collaborated so much, just endless phone calls. This is years in the making, and we're very happy to be involved with you guys, because we're all coming from a similar place. And something that we want to add to this, and this is something that Michael has really brought in, is there's a human element. I'm a guy, I didn't grow up around this. These could easily just be names on paper to me. Yeah, this guy lived here, that guy lived there, they knew each other. But there's a human element. The stories Michael tells, oh, hey, my father went to grade school with Paul Castellano. That's very real. And my interest in this, it's in part anthropology. This is a human phenomenon. It's not just movies. It's not just all that. We try to take a very objective approach and not moralize one way or the other, not to glorify, but also not to look down.
Yes.
We're trying to tell the true story of the mafia as best we can as outsiders. And you guys are, Michael's obviously not an outsider, but, you're taking the same approach, RJ, and that's why we're grateful to talk to you and work together on this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen.
You guys are doing very good work.
Thank you, Angelo.
Oh, you guys are just saying, you guys are doing very good work.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
One other thing, Yankees won tonight.
Go Yankees.
There's only one thing that means more to Cosa Nostra to Michael, and that's the Yankees.
What about my cat?
And this cat. But again, gentlemen, you guys stay the course. My advice to you, I've been on YouTube for a while. It's a tough place to be. You deal with people that's very tough at times. Stay within your group of 3 or 4, whatever you guys do. Be careful with where you go. Stay positive, stay good natured, stay with the history, and you'll last. If you and that's my advice to you guys. You guys are going to help make this a subject one day. My greatest goal is to get this thing in where they teach about it like any other piece of history. If you go to college or you're in high school and we crack open books about every other aspect of history, even controversial groups. Don't forget, we study the Nazi Party in high school, in colleges and stuff. We study all facets of history, including controversial groups. My belief is Cosa Nostra is such a rich and fascinating history. It should be a part of those textbooks. And what you guys do, the documents you guys put together, you guys going out doing your deep research, it's what we're doing on YouTube. We're all going to be a part of taking Cosa Nostra to a place of academia, and a theory place, a philosophical place. So I'm grateful for you guys appearing on our show. It's a great honor for me, and I don't just say that for the show. It's a great honor to appear with the 4 of you gentlemen. Rick, anything you want to say before we close out?
Yeah, thank you for having us on. You know, even though I got a frozen window,
Rick,
I
you look
appreciate
great.
it. You know,
You would have won the non-blinking contest right now.
yeah,
Hey, Rick,
So,
I have had screens
really
freeze
appreciate
on
it.
me. I have had screens freeze on me, and I can't tell you, you got the best frozen screen I've ever seen. So,
Yeah, your mouth is closed. Sometimes it's an open mouth. You know, you lucked out.
guys, please, 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 click the link in the description. Please subscribe to the Mob Archaeologists. Please support what they do. Michael puts his full stamp, his full endorsement on what they do on their work. So please subscribe, please support. We appreciate you guys. Thank you. Peace and love. And we'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody. Have a great night. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.